Hello, everyone, and welcome. We are excited to have you here for today's webinar, Restoring the Past, Perspectives from the Center for Restorative History. My name is Jonathan Swartz, Associate Director at the Zehr Institute for Restorative Justice here at Eastern Mennonite University in Harrisonburg, Virginia, and want to welcome you to this webinar. I'm going to be going over our agenda, as well as helping with the online platform today. So just a bit about what's ahead. Our host, Tarek, will, in a little bit, will introduce the topic and our guest speakers. There will be some time for presentation by the speakers, and then some Q&A moderated by the host. And then I'll have some announcements related to some of the events of the Zehr Institute and of the Center for Justice and Peace Building. And then we'll kick it back to Tarek for some final words, for some closing words. So at this point, I will pass it to Tarek for introducing our for hosting and introducing our presenters for today.
Thank you, John. Hello, everyone. Welcome. It's a pleasure to be here. So we have two individuals I'm happy to present from the new Center for Restorative History at the Smithsonian's National Museum of American History. The first is Tsione Wolde-Michael, curator of the African American Social Justice History at the Smithsonian, where she also serves as the director for the Center of Restorative History, focusing on redress and restorative justice in museums and innovative approaches to community engagement, collections, management, and so forth. Tsione has wide international experience, and you can find out more on the Zehr Institute website, where the full bio is posted. And then we also have with us Nancy Bercaw, who is also a curator of political history at the National Museum of American History and deputy director at the new Center for Restorative History. Her work focuses on creating space for histories that are excluded from national narratives, and she's got experience exhibiting a wide variety, or curating a wide variety of exhibits. Again, refer you to the in-depth bio that's on the Zehr Institute website. Today's topic is on restoring the past. We're going to get perspectives from both Tsione and Nancy from the Center for Restorative History. Before we do that, I wanted to quote the prolific writer across many different mediums, intellectual, visionary, James Baldwin, who said, "People are trapped in history, and history is trapped in them." And I wondered if in museums doing the work of restoring history, the history that is trapped in all of us, they are also doing the work of freeing us from the ways that history binds us. So we're going to be talking about the role, what does it even mean to engage historical redress and restorative justice in the context of museums and curatorial work? What role do historically harmed communities have in this process? What are the challenges and the potentials for using national museum spaces like the National Museum of American History? So without further ado, I'm happy to pass it over to Tsione, and we'll have her speak for about 25 minutes or so. Then we'll be opening up to a discussion. And so if you do have questions, you can find the comment function on whatever platform you're using and send them over to us. Thank you so much. Tsione, take it away.
Thanks so much, Tarek. And good afternoon, everyone. Thanks so much for allowing Nancy and I this opportunity to present to you all. As was mentioned, my name is Tsione Wolde-Michael, and I'm a curator of African American social justice history and also director of the Center for Restorative History at the National Museum of American History. It's really a pleasure to share with you today the work of the center, which is dedicated to creating museum and community-based practice that's grounded in the principles of restorative justice. And we'll spend some time together thinking through what it means to not just look at history through a restorative lens, but what it also means to actually do history or do museum practice through this lens as well. So I'm waiting for the slideshow to come up. I'm not sure if it's up for other folks. Perfect. Great. And we can flip to the next slide. Thanks so much. So we want to begin by framing out museum work, especially for those of you who may be less familiar. There are several types of museum work, which you see listed here, many of which actually intersect. These include work in curatorial, collections work, and that includes research and care and stewardship of the collection, and can even include actions like repatriation. We have educators, we have folks who specialize in programming, digital engagement, fundraising and PR, administrative work, of course, and the important work of priming those who will be the future of the field through internships and fellowships as well. And in our field, there are unfortunate and inaccurate hierarchies assigned to museum work. So typically, with curators, work being seen as primary and traditionally holding the most authority, and work in some of these other areas as being seen as secondary or supplementary or somehow less specialized. And we'll share more in a bit about how our work really seeks to disrupt these categories and hierarchies. Next slide. With regard to museum practice, there are many approaches, but we wanted to outline three here. The first two, so DEIA and decolonization, have really gained traction in the field with mixed results and sometimes, frankly, unclear definitions. As a team, this is really where we wanted to start our research in developing a different kind of museum practice. So trying to really study existing approaches and, when unclear, turning to definitions led by BIPOC communities. Two approaches listed here in particular, decolonization and restorative justice, push for a paradigm shift in museum practice. And we found restorative justice especially compelling. And we hadn't yet seen it applied to history in a concrete way with a clear methodology for museum workers. Next slide. But we want to start by telling you a bit about how we personally arrived at this line of work. Nancy and I came to the National Museum of American History after years of working at the National Museum of African American History and Culture, also a part of the Smithsonian Institution, where we created the Slavery and Freedom exhibit along with co-curator Mary Elliott. And at the time, there were no major collections for the museum. It was brand new, right? No building. And there still was no comprehensive national narrative on slavery at a Smithsonian museum. And to be frank, the subject was still very controversial for that reason. And through our work there, we really learned best practices in community engagement and exhibit development related to some of our nation's most challenging subject matter. Nancy and I are incredibly proud of that work, especially for the ways it engaged communities around the country and really transformed American understandings of slavery. Next slide. Now, to do that work, we had to develop deep practices in community engagement. Since we began our work, again, with no collections, we had to really grow our object count by creating strong ties with communities and local organizations and individuals across the country. Pictured here, for instance, is the community of Edisto Island, South Carolina, where we brought together descendants of both enslaved and slaveholders to bring rare objects like this slave cabin into our collection. Part of this work is also about gaining and building trust. So we had to show a genuine commitment to truth telling and redressing aspects of our national narrative that have been exclusionary. And so these are the practices and concerns that we've brought to our work at the National Museum of American History, also called NMAH. And I should say I made the transition to NMAH, as did Nancy, with the challenge of seeing if we could make one of the units at the Smithsonian that's perpetuated some of the most harm actually pivot. And so that, along with a desire to hone this redressive, community engaged curatorial practice into a theory and method, is what really led us to develop the Center for Restorative History. Next slide. This center comes at a critical moment where our museum has a new director, a new strategic plan, and a new tactical plan, along with a new mission that you see here, dedicated to creating a more just and compassionate future through the study of history. It's a really exciting time at our museum. We're in this tremendous period of growth and transition as one of the units of the Smithsonian. And I think we've seen, especially over the last few years, the way that those same transitions are true for our country as well. And at NMAH, we have this special opportunity, and of course with it, this profound responsibility to document and tell American history in the most inclusive and relevant and intersectional way possible. And we have a particular responsibility to those that we have left out of our national story. Many of our museum's most cutting edge projects are coming from a similar intellectual framework. And this center really brings those focused on piloting a specific type of redress work with historically harmed communities into conversation with one another and under one roof. Next slide. Our challenge, though, at NMAH is not just relationship building with historically harmed communities. It is also in our institution's own history made visible on the museum floor, as you see here. So when thinking about how to address these problems holistically, we concluded that redress work was the most appropriate and the most honest point of intervention. So having a real accounting of harms and change structures and museum practices. And in our research, we've especially found restorative justice to be an incredibly helpful model. Next slide. But before we get into the practices and the center details, we want to introduce you to our staff and define some of our terms. The composition of our staff is unusual for a museum work and for a center of our kind. And so, all of this was quite intentional. Our staff is majority people of color, with representation from every department of the museum. And among us, we have expertise in education, programming, collections management, archiving, oral histories, curation, and internship development. Next slide. And part of what's so exciting is that we're working together to create a lab-like space. A place for us to really experiment with new methods and prototype new ways of working with each other without the usual silos that could mean research is only supposed to be done by a certain group of museum professionals. And instead, we're doing this work together, bringing our collective expertise and doing so under the umbrella of redress and restorative justice work. Next slide. So what is this concept and terminology of restorative history that we're proposing? Well, it comes out of the 50-year-long practice of restorative justice, which many of you here already know well, is the process of seeking resolution to an injustice by redressing the harm done to victims, holding offending parties accountable for their actions, and engaging the community in the meaningful resolution of that conflict. So in an effort to put things as right as possible, we were really inspired by these questions that restorative justice asks about: who has been harmed? What are their needs? Whose obligation is it? Next slide. We define restorative history as a theoretical approach to museum work that uses the power of history as a tool to address the harms of exclusion from our national story in multiple ways. We've come up with this explicit theory and method for doing redressive practice, understanding that one doesn't currently exist in the field. This isn't just a novel term that we're proposing for the field of public history. It's really a practical methodology that we've rigorously piloted with communities and ongoing consultation with domestic and international leaders in the field. And what we found is that part of our unique contribution to this work as public historians is that we can do something that folks in the restorative justice community admit that they sometimes struggle with. And that's to have the time and space to have a serious examination of root causes and to offer that important historical context. Using the principles of restorative justice, then, our methodology specifically brings communities together to identify harms, needs, and obligations, but it's also using the study of history to identify root causes, and in the case of a national museum, really changes our national narrative to be more accurate, to be more community-based and more inclusive. Restorative history does this by working with communities to expose silenced truths, to really redefine notions of belonging and change our institutions to be civically responsible and move us towards a path of redress and healing. Pictured here, for instance, is the Emmett Till marker, which is placed in memoriam at Till's lynching site and is continually defaced and shot at to this day. Each time the marker was shot, the community of Tallahatchie County, Mississippi lobbied and pieced together funds to put up a new marker until they finally had to install a bulletproof sign. We've co-curated an exhibit with the community on this sensitive and incredibly powerful object that they say to them holds as much meaning as Till's very body. Beginning last fall, the marker was put on display in Flag Hall, which is an atrium area of the museum that's typically not an exhibitionary space, and is right underneath the Star Spangled Banner exhibition. I should say that this is a space that the museum hasn't showcased an object since 1998. And this work has allowed us to not only bring in a sacred object that really speaks to our nation's present as much as its past, but it's also allowed us to help the community do what they want most, which was first to really foreground Till's local Mississippi story, which is an incredible story of Black organizers in the 70s fighting to put Black history on the political docket at a time when Till's memory was virtually erased in Tallahatchie County. And this was because they really saw Black history's preservation as a fundamental right, on par with things like clean water and fair housing. And their decades of organizing really culminated in these markers being placed throughout the landscape. And secondly, what the community wanted most was to bring resources to develop a local community center that really serves the Black community there. And how we arrive at this important work begins with asking those questions that center restorative practice. Next slide. So in essence, as you see pictured here, this is the final exhibition. So in essence, when we apply restorative history, we're really striving to address the gap in examining root causes. We're really confronting the legacies of injustice that our institutions have perpetuated, and it pushes us to attempt to right those wrongs together with the communities that are most impacted. It amplifies the practice of community engagement and co-curation, giving communities greater access and control to the ways that their stories are told on the national stage. It calls for a reassessment of our collections, which is so key in museum work, and that's including the type of terminology that we use to classify them. And it requires that we do mutual capacity building that involves real resource exchange. So in practice, restorative history really requires sustained engagement with underserved communities. It's about furthering critical dialogue on race and equity and generating scholarships scholarship with communities, and it requires strategic partnerships with underrepresented groups and under-resourced organizations. So this isn't about one-off projects. It's not just about race. It's about fundamentally reorienting work towards redress and the legacy of our institution. Next slide. Our center's 8 pilots are organized under 4 areas that you see pictured here: community engagement, collections, strategic partnerships, that's inclusive of our internships program, and engaged scholarship, most of which we'll touch on in a bit. But I should mention, part of what makes this project special is that we have a designated research arm providing focused study and consultation on best practices. Next slide. As you can see from where we're working, many of these projects are multi-year and multi-site. In fact, we already are connected to over 100 individuals and organizations around the country who are our community partners in this work. Next slide. And in terms of how we work, community engagement and co-creation is at our foundation, which really requires genuinely listening to and learning from partners to build that long-term foundation of trust and respect. This work takes time, up to 2 to 3 years, which we've mapped out into roughly 4 stages you see on the right, focused on learning, collaborating, collecting, and mutual capacity building. And during the Q&A, we can talk a little bit more about how this approach to and timeline for community engagement work and mutual capacity building really upends some of the more traditional approaches to doing this type of work in museums. Internally, we've embraced the ethos of a startup and have intentionally kept a lab-like feel as a space for prototyping and experimentation. And that being said, we're also working on creating a center culture too. And that's really meant thinking about less hierarchical work models, consensus-based decision-making, and really experimenting with simultaneous work across departments in a single setting. Next slide. So we'd like to now briefly introduce you to some of the center's projects, all of which feed the mission and methodology of the center. Focused on building collections and intersectional histories is the Nation of Sanctuary project. It engages Asian, Latin American, Native, and African American communities that have experienced displacement to examine the complicated history of sanctuary politics in the US. And this work really provides critical insight into how unique but sometimes shared histories of displacement and settlement have shaped these lasting ideas of protection and belonging and exclusion in our country. Next slide. The Undocumented Project is a 3-year collecting initiative dedicated to chronicling undocumented organizing across 6 sites. Part of what's so exciting, I think, about this project is that there have really only been a few signature moments in the nation's history when people who didn't have citizenship or voting rights changed government policy. So it happened during emancipation and women's suffrage and civil rights. And it's happening again right now with undocumented young people. So to capture this historic moment, this project collects objects and oral histories, and it does so in very close partnership with undocumented organizers, really helping to shape the scope. So really involved in that curatorial process. Pictured here, for instance, is the project's oral historian collecting a narrative for our collection. At the foundation of this work is a commitment to community engagement and co-curation. I think that much is evident, but it's also about prototyping mutual capacity building practices that are centered on an equal valuing of community and museum expertise. So really seeing communities as sites of knowledge and sites of knowledge production, not just sites of study. In this way, the project is really creating a true intellectual exchange, enabling communities to influence museum practice, and for NMAH to build community capacity as well. Next slide. Real mutual capacity building is also about resource exchange. As another example, we are in the early stages of our BLM collecting initiative, which works closely with Movement for Black Lives activists around the country to capture their unique local concerns and approaches to the movement from 2012 onward. So together with this, as a part of this project, we will collect and co-curate and build capacity by asking what it is that we can provide organizers over the next few years in our role as a public history institution. And based on their needs, folks are asking for help with really learning how to preserve their own histories. So things like having us donate oral histories or provide videography of personal accounts for free, or offer focused trainings. And last summer, for instance, per their request, we put on a fully paid and stipended workshop showing activists how to preserve their own objects, how to learn to create community archives, teaching the principles of Black archival practice, and also exposing folks to some of the principles of curatorial interpretation as well. Next slide. The center also supports groundbreaking work in collections reassessments. Just as an example, currently the museum has no effective way to identify objects relating to African-American history, for instance. And that's really due to the size and age of the collection. And that has a huge impact on the stories we can tell. But we have developed a method to be able to conduct an inventory on our Black political history holdings. And this is a project that uses reparative strategies to make really critical decisions regarding informatics. So that's which subject headings we keep or delete or change or collapse into other categories to make these objects described in ways that are accurate and respectful, but also findable. We're really proud to say that this work has been identified by the Smithsonian as a prototype for increasing intellectual control over our collection of nearly 2 million objects, and making findable, otherwise unknown and unsearchable specialty area collections. The result, we hope, of this project eventually being implemented will be better care, stronger stewardship, and increased public access to Black history. So pictured here, for instance, are photos from our Juneteenth and BLM collecting in 2020, which will become a part of this inventory as well. Slide. The center is also thinking about strategic local and global partnerships too. Essential to this work is our decolonization working group, which is part of our center's research arm and provides thought leadership and focused study and ongoing education related to decolonization and redress work in the field. So in addition to tracking the interpretive and archival and collections trends, this group also keeps a pulse on the related work of our colleagues across the Smithsonian and really the field writ large. Our first year goals include community consultation on our land acknowledgement, facilitating continued educational opportunities for Smithsonian staff, and really convening scholars and practitioners doing this work around the world, and consulting on collections projects related to repatriation. Next slide. Next slide, please. Thank you. With regard to strategic partnerships, the center is also thinking about how we do restorative work for the future of the profession too. So beginning actually 2 falls ago, NMAH in collaboration with the Goucher Prison Education Partnership, or GPEP, began providing fully paid year-long internships to formerly incarcerated GPEP alumni. This is really a landmark program. It's unlike one that exists at any other public history institution or museum in the country. And it's really piloting how to engage communities that have been neglected or even exploited by museums, and how to think more expansively of the diversity that we want to see in our field. I should say that this community was very intentionally selected out of recognition of the Smithsonian's history in using incarcerated labor. And with the interest of building trust and redressing harm, this program has been as transformative for our museum as it has been for our interns, who are also our close partners in shaping its scope. Next slide. So one of our most frequently asked questions is, how is restorative history different from the community collecting that's happened across the Smithsonian for some time? Or why do this type of work at a national museum? And I think that the answer to those questions is that this is really a legacy in terms of the community collecting that's happened historically at the Smithsonian and within the field, that this project is seeking to honor and build upon. We know that longstanding work has happened in community collecting, and we really see restorative history as a tool in a broader toolbox of museum practice that's grounded in the principles of restorative justice with this clearly articulated focus on redress. As I mentioned, similar curatorial practices have really been the bedrock of the Smithsonian Institution for decades. But what I think the center offers is something that's more coordinated. So not only are we naming a concrete methodology for how to do restorative community-based work where one doesn't currently exist in our field, but we're also trying to bring the diverse knowledge of those doing this work across the institution, across these various fields together in a sustained way. And as one of the units of the Smithsonian that has the longest history of harm, we think it's really fitting that this methodology is coming out of NMAH from a team comprised of a majority of specialists of color. Another point that I think sets this work apart is that we focus on communities that our institution has participated in harming, and we develop that minimum 2 to 3 year commitment to do redressive work and long-term mutual capacity building. This type of multi-year engagement that is long-term is something rare at the Smithsonian and really museums in general, because it's really hard to sustain. But we really see this as an incredible opportunity, and together with communities, we work to identify those harms, the needs, the obligations of our institution. And additionally, we commit ourselves to a critical examination of root causes in our products, whether that's our exhibitions, our programs, our collecting initiatives, internships, etc. Next slide. So as a result of the center, we will build trust with communities that we have really wronged. We continue to build our new intellectual framework. Most recently, this summer, we just hosted a series of convenings of leaders in the field to tackle the theory and method of restorative history and create a shared language. We hope to be a site to help support and guide best museum practice, be it in collections, community engagement, or co-curation. And we also hope to continue to create these partnerships with at-risk communities and global consortiums examining issues of redress. And lastly, we think what we offer is a functional framework for overlapping interests with other Smithsonian units and centers. So as the National Museum of American History, we want to support, not replicate, the missions of the National Museum of the American Indian or the National Museum of African American History and Culture, our Latino Center, for instance. But we want to do that while also offering a new point of orientation for the broader institution. And I can't really stress that enough. I think, to be clear, the role of highly specialized identity-based museums is something that can't be understated. Nancy and I come from one, right? So we know their importance firsthand. But if our broader institutions don't shift, right, the paradigm doesn't either. And that's why approaching our work in a way that is integrative and intersectional is so urgent, especially, I think, in this moment that we find ourselves in as a country. And it's why with this center, the Smithsonian can be really positioned, we hope, as one of the leading voices in doing this work to repair harm in the field and also work to transform it. Next slide. Again, thank you for allowing us the opportunity to present to you all today, and we really look forward to our discussion.
Thank you, Tsione. So I want to remind folks, if you have questions, then use the comment function on the platform that you are at, and we will make sure those questions get fed into this discussion. And while we're waiting for some of those questions or comments to come up, I'd like to start it off. You mentioned that the Smithsonian National Museums are themselves or have been themselves a source of harm. And I wonder if either of you could go into greater depth or perhaps give an example. And then I wonder if you could paint a picture of, as an institution, how do you do redress for harms like that?
Well, I can take some of the history of the institution. So the institution was formed back in 1848, and that's the same time that the United States was really involved in empire building. And some of the earliest collections that came into the museum were a result of kind of imperial conquest. So lots of objects from different indigenous people were stolen. People's bodies were dug up and sent to the Smithsonian. And so this is really part of all museums, most museums, especially national museums' legacies, is that really as different wars and different conquests and different empires are built, the museum becomes the repository for understanding and then classifying others. So museums were really built on these hierarchies. They were seen as a good public institution where people could learn. So you didn't necessarily need to go to a school. You could just walk into a public museum and you could actually see the relationship between different peoples because they would be actually displayed in a hierarchy. Same with plants and animals and the like. So it's part of this general classification system. And I think it's something that museums are grappling with and have been grappling with for some time. So we've really been inspired by museums around the world who are trying to redress this kind of practice. And we're happy to talk about that more. But that just gives you some insight.
And I'll just add, Tarek, you had a question about an example of how we concretely go about redressing some of those harms through our museum practice and through history. So part of this process, as Nancy alluded to, is reflecting on ourselves, not just as a field or a set of disciplines, but also as an institution as well. And in that process, you know, and in knowing that history, we know that the Smithsonian, for instance, as I mentioned during the presentation, has made use of incarcerated labor, and much, you know, similar to many other museums and even universities today, maintains preferred contracts with places like Unicor, for instance. And so in thinking about how do we think about the diversity of our field, how do we think about inclusion through a redressive lens and a reparative lens, we said this is a community that we clearly need to engage and, you know, have a voice in terms of the work that's happening across museums. So we developed this program in partnership with the Goucher Prison Education Partnership, which is located in just outside of Baltimore, Maryland, so in our backyard. And the majority of folks who come through Goucher's program, which is one of just a handful of programs in the country that offers folks who are incarcerated to earn a BA while inside, you know, we noticed a gap in that, you know, folks coming out actually were at a disadvantage because of having pursued some college or in fact earning their bachelor's degree from a reputable liberal arts institution. And that's because many of the programs that are catered to folks who are recently coming out are geared towards people who have a high school diploma or maybe lower. And so there was a real opportunity here in thinking about how can we create pipelines for, folks coming out of that program, people who are predominantly from the DC, Maryland, Virginia area, to be able to pursue fields in museum practice. And our internship is not just focused on curatorial work. We have folks interning in areas of, yes, African American social justice history, but also in IT departments, folks who are doing project management and really building career experience. The internship is fully paid, long-term. We use federal dollars to pay for this internship. And when I say long-term, we're talking about a minimum of 1 year. And in many cases, there are opportunities for folks to go to other museums around the institution. Part of this process is also not just about creating opportunities, but also creating different policies as well. So as you might imagine, to be able to have folks be badged and credentialed at a federal institution like ours, we had to rethink the federal background investigation process. And we worked very closely with our Office of Protective Services to create an MOU, to create a model that, if the federal government chooses to use, can be used to create more inclusive hiring practices as well. So this is one, concrete example of how we're taking the history that we know, working with communities that have been directly impacted, and creating the programs, but also the policy changes that are needed as well.
Thank you, Tsione. We do have one question in the chat, which is, I have a passion for historical redress at my local community level. How can I ensure there's a repository for archives and stories at a local level? Either of you want to take that?
Sure. Nancy, did you maybe want to talk about some of the work that we've done with allied work with folks who are focused on community-based archives, especially in areas actively experiencing trauma?
Yeah, so one of the projects that I help lead is the Undocumented Organizing Collecting Initiative. And in doing that work, I want to go back to the quote that you opened with, that, people are trapped in history and history is trapped in us. And I feel that people are really aware of the history that's embodied within them. And so when we're doing this work, it's not necessarily for us to come and say, this is your particular history, that you can really, different communities and different agencies have begun actually creating their own manifestations of their history in these local community archives. So Tina, when you're asking the question about how can you ensure that there's a repository for those archives and stories at a local level, there are different groups that are doing this. And one group you might look into is called DocNow, that's at the University of Maryland. And they really think about how the pros and cons, the benefits of community archives. There's also a community archive that I'm always really inspired by, which is Texas After Violence, which is in Texas. And so I think the best place to start is to really, I would say, begin with DocNow and kind of follow those different leads in order to find some of the resources that might be available to you.
Thank you, Nancy. So there is a question about making the slide deck available. Let's see. So this is from someone who works with departments of corrections implementing RJ processes, would also like to reach out to learn more about your program involving formerly incarcerated individuals. I mean, perhaps this is an opportunity to say a little bit about how to be in touch or learn more about your work.
Sure, please we love connecting with folks and being able to share out about our work, but also learn about people who are doing allied work across the country. Feel free to go to our website. You'll see under the staff page a list of our core staff. And feel free, if you have particular questions, to reach out to me or Nancy directly, along with our colleague Caroline Spears, who runs our intern program. I should also say that as we turn to the fall, sorry, I'm hearing some feedback. But as we turn to the fall, we are also going to be producing several toolkits. And one of those toolkits will also be geared towards folks who might be interested in creating similar internship programs, involving and working with formerly incarcerated adults. And so we really look forward to putting that out. Please keep a close eye on our webpage for when that comes out.
Great, thank you. So I want to ask you another question. You mentioned at some point that you're upending conventional museum practices, and perhaps you can give us a bit of a contrast of, we heard some of what you're doing. What would it look like in a more traditional museum setting?
Yeah, so I think the process of, for instance, collecting an object looks really different, and we can talk about, maybe Nancy, you and I can tag team about Till a little bit and how that's an example of our very different collecting practices. So typically a curator would find an object of interest or learn about an object of interest. Maybe they make what's known as a look-see visit, where they go for usually the span of no more than a couple of days to visit a site, but oftentimes maybe not even visit at all, just pick up the phone, talk to whoever else might be on the other line, and arrange for the shipment of a particular object to the museum. And they, as really who's seen as the intellectual, the keeper of the intellectual authority of the object, would then do the interpretation work, which you may see on the museum floor in an exhibition, but also in terms of oftentimes dictating the type of cataloging process that happens as well. We've taken a very different approach that changes fundamentally the timelines to the type of work that we do, the budgets involved, and also where authority lies. And I think the collecting that we do with the face is just one example of that. So for instance, Nancy and I, when we had first learned about the marker, had reached out to the Emmett Till Commission to learn more about, the history of the marker. And we said, clearly we need to make a trip down to Mississippi. And we traveled not only throughout the state of Mississippi, but also into Alabama over a week-long visit, which we repeated again months later. So 2 separate week-long visits, talking to not just Till family members, folks in Tallahatchie County, of course, to learn the local history, but also talking to civil rights leaders, HBCUs, keepers of this history, the State Museum, small local Black public history institutions, asking each what it would mean for an object like this to be removed from its site, and what would it mean for it to come to a national museum? What would our obligations be? Of course, primarily to the community of Tallahatchie County, but also to the state as well, and people who have been preserving this history at great risk to their personal safety for decades. In that process, we confronted what we often are used to experiencing as folks who represent a national museum and a federal institution, which was a healthy degree of skepticism of why we were interested in this history and whether or not we were equipped to appropriately steward it with the sensitivity, but also with the unique local knowledge that these objects are imbued with, and that frankly, the scholarship is just now catching up to, right? And so our process was one where we really engaged in those 4 steps that you saw in the presentation, but deep listening, learning, and folks were surprised. Like when we came back, they said, "Wow, you came back. We weren't expecting this," and demonstrating our commitment. This process, which did not guarantee the collection of the object, took months, and it also took several thousands of dollars, right, in terms of the budget. But we wanted to have the opportunity to get to know each other and to have that exchange of knowledge and information. And so in many ways, part of how we're upending museum practices, so much of it is fundamentally about the product that is created at the end. So the object turning to exhibit. And instead for us, the product is the process of this exchange and engagement. And hopefully, if all parties agree, being able to steward this history and its deep community knowledge. Nancy, did you want to add to that or talk a little bit about what some of that history was that we learned?
Yeah, I think I'd like to add just the example that Tsione showed the slave cabin in the presentation of when that cabin was collected by the National Museum of African American History and Culture. And I think it was really that experience that at first the museum actually planned for the cabin just to be dismantled and packed up and taken to Washington. And that just didn't seem right because it was the last surviving cabin on the island. And people had a direct and immediate tie. And that's true with all of these objects, right? That they have real deep meaning to communities and to people. And it's because everyone holds their history, right? So you can't just come and remove an object and say, we're going to fit it into our category. We're going to fit it into our sense of what the true historical narrative is. But what we really experienced with the dismantling of that cabin was that we got in touch, we used Ancestry, and we got in touch with everyone who might be related to that particular cabin. And we went down a week early, met with them, but then everyone just wanted to see it being dismantled. And so they're descendants of slaveholders, descendants of people who had been enslaved, and a largely Latino work crew. And everyone was around that particular object telling their story. And so what would happen is that eventually the news media showed up and everyone would give their narrative of what the true meaning of that space and what the true history was. And over the entire week, everyone really sat and listened to the stories that were being told about a thing. And they were bringing their whole selves to that. And based on that experience, we just really understood the power of what objects carry into a situation and the different histories that are embedded within them, but also the way that they evoke that really powerful storytelling, which is not just storytelling, it is really the history, right? And it's not truncated into this history or that history. It is the many multiplicities of history. And going back to the Baldwin quote about, that history is trapped in all of us, what does it mean if that history is, how do you process that if it's never reflected anywhere else? And so, and what do you do with the fact that it's constantly being denied, or that no one's giving you tools to be able to express it? And I think communities have really, and individuals have discovered this on their own. And so really what our job is to bring that fullness into a national space and have people rethink what historical production is, and to have people be able to see the fullness of themselves within a museum. So how do you go about doing that? And really with the till marker, I think we were able to, once again, hear all of those multiplicities of stories. But one thing that became really clear is that because of different funding mechanisms and just the way that the cultural climate works, is that there'll be funding for a specific thing, or people think history is a specific thing. So with Emmett Till, it's really about that horrible moment of his lynching. But for the people in Tallahatchie County, it's not only that, but it's the fact that that history and what enabled that history to happen is still continuing on. And we can actually see that in this object. And it's not something that you can just say, oh, that is a moment that's frozen in time, and we're just going to look at that. And I think what cultural institutions do is, and what historians do, is just say, oh, we're just going to look at that particular moment. But, you know, it's the whole fact that history has this life that continues to live within us, and it continues to also shape our actions. And so I think that's what we really learned from doing the deep listening to everyone in the community, is how that history still is ongoing. And then what is the goal of a cultural institution in that regard? Many people would say, we've done the exhibit, we're all done. But really the fact that that level of terror still exists for this community is something, and that they've come up with creative ways to navigate that, and also to kind of, to live full lives, that what can we do in order to support that? And what they're really asking for is this community center. So what can we as a cultural institution do to help that?
And Tarek, I just want to go back to your initial question, which was about changed practices or how our approach is so different. And so we've just explained we've elaborated on one element, which is the collections process, right? But you can see the ways that it's rather robust. But on the back end, and thinking about exhibiting the sign too, there were a lot of challenges to this new approach that we were really proposing. In the field of museum work, people often talk about co-curation, but that's not always clearly defined. And our mode of co-curation is quite extensive. And that's because we really want to have the opportunity for authority to lie with communities, and for first-person voices to really come forward, not just in the exhibitionary work, but also in the archive as well. So that sort of changing in voice and authority was very new. And how do you begin to implement that? So even in terms of our design decisions, where the marker would be located in the museum, down to the actual major themes of the narrative that we put forward, also reviewing of the actual writing generated. All of this was done in partnership with community members from Tallahatchie County, and also Till family members. That changed our timelines for things, right? Because we had this process of going back and forth to be able to have that review. And we also had to do a great deal of advocacy, saying, the buck doesn't stop with our voice as curators, right? Or our museum. It really requires that sign off from the community. So again, very different ways of conducting the work that also had very real structural and practical implications for the way that we do our work and the timelines as well.
Yeah, this has been fascinating. I'm particularly struck by something like the Till marker or the cabin, both representing a history and a past point of time, and then the way people have engaged with those objects as representing a history as it continues to unfold. And how can you show both of those kind of historical perspectives, the moment in the past and then the continual unfolding? And I'm wondering, with these objects that you have, such as the Till marker, are there plans to return them? What is the long-term plan for objects like that, and particularly the objects that was mentioned had been collected during the U.S.'s imperial adventures? Where will those go? And what's your thinking about how to do that?
Yeah, thanks so much for mentioning that, Tarek. And I think the work of redress really is the work of also unpacking the afterlives of these histories, right? So it's not just having an examination of the history itself, but it's seeing the ways that it plays out in the present. And that's a necessary part of the work. I think what you're alluding to is something that our institution is exploring but struggling with, which is thinking about the idea of shared stewardship. That's something that community-based museums have really been able to do in much more radical ways, I think, and that's in part because they're able to be more nimble than larger institutions, let alone a federal institution. But the notion of shared stewardship is really that you may co-own an object or have, shared authority over an object with the community. That's still something on the horizon that we cannot yet do legally, but it's certainly something that we have our pulse on in terms of the folks who are able to do that work and are leading that work. We do have also at the National Museum of Natural History and the National Museum of the American Indian dedicated repatriation divisions as well. So there are focused offices working to identify objects in the collections that are in need of repatriation and working hand in hand with communities around the globe to make that a possibility.
Yeah, and I think the real difficulty with the museum structure and what collecting is about is that it's a legal exchange, and so it's one concept of law and one concept of property ownership that's occurring. And because our institution has been built on that over several generations and centuries, it's something that is difficult for the institution to even conceive of that language, which is why it's really, when we go and travel the country and actually work with people and ask exactly what it is that they expect from the institution, it's really wonderful to get these different challenges that we then bring back to the institution and think about how we can actually recreate these relationships. But I think it's a difficult one.
Thank you both. We have another comment and question in the chat here. Good afternoon. I'm from Haiti. I know that museums are storytellers, but back home in many places, storytellers are actual people. How do we hold a space for those people in contexts like Haiti and imagine a museum with physical people who hold stories? This is something I always think about contributing to.
That is such a wonderful question. Thank you so much for asking it. And I can't say that there are any answers, but you're really speaking to one of our dear colleagues, Jose Centeno Melendez, who's our oral historian, who actually went to school to get like a formal oral history background exactly because of what you're speaking of. Is that he grew up, never saw his history reflected in the classroom or in any institutional spaces, but he sat at the dinner table. He sat at various parties and heard everyone tell the story of the place and where people had come from. And that was never really there was no place for that within our institutions. And so I think that's a real challenge about whether or not our institution can hold these places for people. And it kind of brings me back to the earlier question we had about the community-based centers and whether or not those can be places where this occurs. But I do know that, this work is happening in different places around the globe, and Casa de Memoria in Colombia actually does have people who have experienced these histories engage in different activities within the museum. Often they just go there for the different sewing groups and different talking groups, but they actually are creating, Olivia, what it is that you're kind of indicating. So thank you so much for that question. Tsione, do you have something to add?
Sure. I'll just add in terms of ways that translates to museum practices. All of these museums have docent programs. The National Museum of African American History and Culture in particular has an incredibly robust docent program, which is this amazing opportunity for any member of the general public to spend time with focused study, to be able to deeply understand and be able to convey stories from each one of the exhibitions, and be able to do so, incorporating to a degree their own personal perspectives as well. Nancy, with the Undocumented Project, but also with our Sanctuary Project as well, this fall into the coming year, are really looking to, again, foreground those first-person voices and have high impact in terms of folks being able to really encounter them broadly. And so we're really excited to have a variety of digital offerings and programs on our website that will have people being able to tell their stories firsthand to broader audiences and the public, and storytell in that way. And then I think it's also about the work that we're doing with, again, really foregrounding community knowledge, local expertise, and really being able to make sure that the products that we create, whether it's our programs or our exhibitions or educational materials, are bringing forward these different worldviews that people have, whether it's of folks who look at what in museums we call objects, but they might call their people, right? These are sacred, spiritual people who are deserving of ongoing care and changed care standards for our collections, et cetera. So, being able to have these conversations and shake up practice and do that through the storytelling, I think is really key.
Thank you both. So I have another question I'd like to pose to you. I'm going to take it a bit into this age of conspiracy theories and fake news, of social media bubbles, where what is real, what is not real, is hotly contested. How are you navigating these kinds of dynamics all around us?
I think we have a particular intervention as a public history institution, but also the nation's museum system, to be able to offer history and truth-telling in ways that are compelling and relevant. There was a Pew study that was done, I may be mistaken on the year, but I believe it was 2016, that showed that museums, actually more so than universities, were, and even the news media, that museums were seen as trusted sources of information for the public. And so I think knowing that, and knowing just how well respected our institution is, the fact that it's this site where 8th graders, it's almost like a pilgrimage, right, will go and learn about their nation's history, that is a privilege, but also a real responsibility that we take very seriously. And that's why we see a slice of the work around history making, history keeping, has to be redressive. And we want to be able to provide that intervention through our work at the center.
And you mentioned, trust in academia, universities. I'm curious, how is you see your work influencing the way history is being practiced in academic settings or amongst private historians, individual historians beyond the museum?
Yeah, I think it's definitely an ongoing project, so that there are a number of historians who work deeply with community engagement, but it's something that the university system has trouble accommodating. And so it's really wonderful to be able to work with people as partners, because we're really on the cusp between academia and also the public, that we really are able to kind of harness that position to kind of bring these two things together and to be able to really actually like ensure that communities can produce their own histories. I mean, they already do, but to bring it into a more national space. So we often have working relationships with academics. Yeah, and so there's constantly dialogue going on, but it's kind of two different institutional bases which structure our work and structure our accessibility to doing this kind of thing.
Do you face any major resistance, both within the institution or amongst your partners, to the kind of innovation you're doing?
I think that we've really benefited from our own museum being really supportive of our work. The fact that we even have a center that's devoted to this type of redress work is hugely innovative within itself. I think where we get the most pushback or where things get sticky is when we're really changing not just museum practice, but also museum policy to align in ways that will support those practices for the long term. And there are ways that, like, for example, with our GPEP internship, that we've been incredibly successful in doing that. I think the Till exhibit is another example of the ways we've been successful. But again, we still have areas that we need to work on and begin, and also work to reimagine as well. Nancy, I saw you were going to try to jump in there.
Yeah, I was just going to say, like, to be honest, of course, there's always a lot of tension. And I think that there's tension within the historical community as well, in terms of who is the holder and the producer of history. Yeah, so it's just like a continual back and forth and open dialogue and conversation.
Yeah, thank you for that. So let's see, there's a comment here. Are there projects that you're looking forward to that you can talk about in the next year?
I think what we're really looking forward to is being able to put out those toolkits. So being able to share with other folks in ways that we hope will be highly adaptable, our method for doing work in the areas of internships, education, but also just putting out information on what we're defining as restorative practice for history. You know, we mentioned this in the presentation, but in our field, there's been a lot of community-based work, but there actually has been no defined theory or method for how to go about that work. And that can be really hard for folks who want to be able to replicate, especially a certain type of redress work, you know, at small institutions, at large institutions like our own. And so we're really looking forward to writing what we know is not the definitive way to do this work, but what we hope is a tool in this broader toolkit of museum practice that folks will be able to pick up and use. And we're going to be doing that through a variety of publications, both academic, but also popular publications, through some of our digital projects, like I mentioned, and you know, also through the toolkits that we produce too.
And I think I have one last question that I'm dying to ask. What about a museum of restorative justice? Is that on anyone's radar? Can we expect something like that coming up to try to educate or raise awareness about this movement to the larger public?
Tarek, can you start it with us?
Count me in. Actually, on a side note, there's a mob museum in Las Vegas, Nevada, who's been open to creating an exhibit right next to their police violence exhibit on restorative justice. Very interesting. Wouldn't have expected it to emerge there. Who knows? Yeah, what were you going to say?
Yeah, I was going to say that there are a lot of great folks who are doing this work, even if it's not encapsulated in a singular museum. You know, I think you've named some of those partners, like the work of Equal Justice Initiative, you know, and their lynching memorial. But the interpretive work is happening on the ground. I'm not aware of a singular museum, at least not in the United States, that's devoted to that subject. But I think the idea of being able to have a dedicated space to rethink museum practice, but also to actually implement that sort of redress work would be incredibly powerful. And I think what we're hoping to do is in our smaller corner and through the center, being able to prototype and figure out what some of those models and new ways of working are.
Well, thank you both. This has been a fascinating and rich conversation. John? So we, actually, I'm going to hand it to you to talk about, I think, our upcoming webinars.
I'm happy to do that. Yes, we have got webinars coming up the rest of this fall. So they're always on Wednesday noon, Wednesday afternoons Eastern time. But we've got one coming up on October 19, another one November 16, and then December 14. All of these can be found on Zehr Institute's website, which is down here at the bottom, zehrinstitute.org. We work with some wonderful folks here at EMU that do strategies for trauma awareness and resilience. And we are lucky to be able to host and have trainings both in person and online. So there are some coming up online. Star Level 1, there is an online training happening September 26th through November 16. That happens on Mondays and Wednesdays. And then a Star Level 2, that happens October 13 through December 8 on Tuesdays and Thursdays. We're continuing to offer a restorative justice master's degree at the Center for Justice and Peace Building at EMU. And we also offer restorative justice graduate certificates. So the certificates in particular allow working professionals to continue working while completing studies. And we really prioritize self-reflective practitioners. So the certificate and our graduate programs help you reflect on your work and increase your knowledge and skills. Restorative Justice in Education is another significant program here at EMU. This focus is for K through 12 educators, administrators, or other school leaders, community leaders, and social workers or school counselors. There's an RJE concentration in the MA in Education program, and there's also a Restorative Justice in Education graduate certificate. And again, as I just referred to a little bit ago, we offer Masters in Conflict Transformation and also an MA in Restorative Justice. We have a practice-based curriculum exploring nonviolent and restorative responses to conflict, and we're fostering reflective, value-based practice and critical self-reflection. There are options to focus in restorative justice, psychosocial trauma, strategic peace building, community development, and organizational leadership, or really create a unique specialization. And lastly, feel free to visit our site, zehrinstitute.org. You can find updates, find out what we're up to, get resources on webinars, and learn about events that are taking place. And there's also a spot, as most websites currently have, a spot for donations. We love to have more partners in continuing both this webinar series and other work of the Zehr Institute. So feel free to donate as you see fit and as you're able. I am going to pass it back to Tarek for some closing comments as we close out this webinar.
And also a deep, warm-hearted thank you to our two guest speakers, Nancy and Tsione. Thank you for making the time to be with us. I think as a closing thought, as I've been listening and imagining the work that you do, the way that you are addressing hierarchies within the institution, the ways that you are thinking about where to place exhibits in such a thoughtful manner, spending time in communities, engaging in dialogues there. It really struck me at how much you really are living these restorative values. And it inspired me, while not a historian or in any way connected to curatorial work, it inspired me to look at the ways that I as well gain information about the past and the present, and in what ways can I be more restorative in my own approaches. So thank you for all of that. We hope to see everyone next month when we'll be talking in honor of Indigenous Peoples Day and Month with Dr. Valandra about moving beyond Indigenous land acknowledgements. Take care.